I'm so glad you're all here. What a good turnout. And welcome to ArtTable and the Women's Forum Joint Program. And we are delighted to be doing this, and we hope to do many more. And thank you to ArtTable for planning tonight's program. I'm Felice Axelrod, and I am on both boards. I'm on the board of the Women's Forum of New York and ArtTable, so that's why I have to talk today. And if any of you have ideas for programs at either forum, please let us know and we'll follow up. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Gillian Gualtieri, who will moderate tonight's program.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here this evening. I'm just so delighted to see so many people interested and excited in this, I think, quite timely. It's okay. Hopefully I won't have to write anything. Well, I'll have so much to write. But this really timely conversation around the future of gender-based organizations. So today we're really thinking about what is a gender-based organization, what is their future in this social, cultural, and political climate. And so I'm a sociologist at Barnard College, so I approach it from a kind of economics, politics, social universe, all facets, understanding of any question. And I think it's really exciting that we have such a diverse panel with different corporate representations and nonprofit representations, the museum world. And so I think it's really exciting that we're going to be able to hear all of these different perspectives today. So my first question is, what is a gender-based organization to you? And do you consider your organization to be a gender-based organization? And Alyssa, I would love it if you could start us off.
Sure. First of all, thank you, Gillian. Oh. Hello. No?
Oh, there you go.
Yep. Yay. Okay. Thank you, Gillian. Thank you, ArtTable, and thank you, Women's Forum. I also want to say this is a slight moment of personal vindication because back in my mid-20s, when I was slightly professionally adrift, I thought, you know what? I'm going to go back to school and I'm going to get my master's in gender politics with a focus on queer theory. This was the early new millennium when conversations about gender as a spectrum, gender beyond the binary were just beginning to bubble up, when people were beginning to tease apart sex and gender. I finished my master's and I thought, well, that was really fun, but what the hell am I going to do with a master's in gender politics? So fast forward to now, to our contemporary climate, where it often feels like the only thing that we're talking about is gender and sexuality. And my current position at the Leslie-Lohman Museum of Art, I'm the executive director, and we are a museum that is focused and dedicated on LGBTQIA+ artists and the work they create. It was founded in 1969 by two white gay men who decided to publicly open their home in Soho, proudly display their collection of gay art, and mind you, this was 1969, it was still illegal to do that. It was just weeks before the Stonewall uprisings, in that moment of liberation and revolution. And the organization continued in many different formats, although primarily for white gay men, until the present. I was hired in the spring of 2021, the first female executive director, the first female queer executive director, and like many EDs who were hired then, I think, I was brought on with a mandate to change the organization, to evolve the organization, and to reimagine what a queer art museum can be and can do. And one of the things that was most exciting for me was the opportunity to think expansively about really the full expansiveness of human desire and human self-representation, which is deeply human and something that we can all relate to. And so, while I frequently hear people say, queer art museum, that's pretty niche. I want to challenge that and say, in fact, the sort of fundamental kind of core of queerness is about curiosity, is about exploring possibilities for thriving in our lives outside of patriarchy, outside the constraints of misogyny, outside of normativity when it becomes toxic, and that is something that is beneficial for all of us, regardless of who you want to sleep with, regardless of what gender you identify as.
Alicin, what is a gender-based organization?
Okay, well first, I don't know how I'm supposed to go after yes, everything you said, everything. I mean, that is what we can only aspire to have, just overall. And you know, when we were having our prep call, we were talking about this gender organization, I think every company or organization I've ever worked for is gendered. Right? It's just, if we're talking about feminism, if we're talking about just equity, then we may be talking about different things, right? But right now, there's a default, right, for the majority of companies, certainly, or organizations, and from what I understand, I'm not as well versed in it, the same as in the art world. So there's, you know, I just now have this like vision and lens of what you just described, and what would happen if we overlaid that in so many of the experiences that we have day to day. And wow, how much easier so many things would be if we were, if others were in that conversation, this conversation with us. But that I honestly couldn't add more in anything like more eloquent than what was just shared. So
it was so beautifully said. Thank you so much. Appreciate it. I grew up in a patriarchal society in India, and where girls had to know their place. I grew up in a very conservative family, so this notion of this was what you could do and this is what you couldn't do actually really was alarming for me, because on one side I saw the women in my community and in my family make most of the decisions, including the financial decisions. The men, all the way from my grandfather, and must have been my great-grandfather, I didn't know him, would hand their paychecks every month to the spouse, and she would give him a stipend. So who really ruled society? The women were just really adept at making the men feel like they were making the decisions. So I knew that there was something there that you had to learn to navigate. Long story short, I came to this country, I went into financial services, where all those lessons learned in India really did well, pretty well. So when you think about gendered organizations, I would tell you that every organization is a gendered organization. It just skews one way or the other. And so when I went from trading commodities to being in wealth management and ultimately making my way to the DEI space, I run Seramount, which is a business services company, and we say we help create inclusive workplaces. And that's the mission and mandate and everything else that goes with it. But many of you may know Seramount as Working Mother, that started 40 years ago, and Carol Evans built that up. And I took over from her in 2015, and we sold to private equity 2 years ago, and we still continue to do what we've always done, which is around how do you create equity for all different people. And you look at it as something that you're addressing the talent needs of the world. And one of my good friends, his name is Brian McNaught, I don't know if you know him, but Brian was one of the pioneers in terms of educating corporate America about the LGBTQ community. And I took him on the road all around the world to talk to Merrill Lynchers at that time about it. And he said something to me that has stayed with me. He said, Subha, you live in a heterosexual world. Everything is structured for you. Can you ever imagine what it would be like to be a heterosexual in a homosexual world? And I want you to think about what would happen if your spouse was in the hospital for something and he isn't really your spouse, he's your partner, because obviously you're heterosexual, so you don't have the benefit. This was before gay marriage was legal. And I remember thinking about it, about how money would get divided if one spouse passes away. And on and on and on. He gave so many examples. And I've never forgotten that. And I remember thinking, inequity doesn't matter in what form it comes or who it impacts. It's terribly hurtful. And it is all, each one of us has a part to play. So when you talk about gender, I think that men have as much a role to play in dismantling the patriarchy as women do. We rail against it, we do all of these things, but I think that we've got to find a way to find that middle road and bring people together, which is not where we are as a country now, but hopefully we can help change that.
Jessica, yeah.
Hello. We got serious very fast, but I'll bring it back to the art world and ArtTable. So ArtTable was established in 1980 by Lila Harnett, our founder, who saw an art world that wasn't very supportive of women who worked in it and who worked in the administration of arts. So not for artists, but women curators and museum directors and conservators and all of that. And she wanted to create a space so that they could come together, support each other, network, leadership, education, all of that became part of the organization early on. And we've been doing that for 43 years and recently changed our mission statement to also include non-binary individuals in that space. So the original idea wasn't ever to exclude anyone, but it was to create more opportunities at the time, because our founder, Lila, just didn't see that those opportunities existed in the same way that they did for men. And she had worked in art publishing, which was really dominated by men at the time, and wanted to carve that out. And so that's what we've been doing.
Yeah, okay, wow. So many exciting, interesting lines of thought. One thing that I really heard across all of your responses was this attention to equity, right? And thinking about inequity and thinking about gender-based organizations in relation to equity and inequity. So I'm wondering, we've made reference to a social moment. Wow, sociology. Okay, a social moment in which there is more widespread questioning or thinking through what is a gender binary and is it a useful tool? And so I'm really interested in how have these social conversations shaped the way in which you think about your work and in the way in which you think about approaching, if all organizations are gendered, maybe not all are gender-based, but all are gendered, how does this larger social conversation around thinking beyond the binary shape how you think about your work? Can I go to you first, Alyssa?
Sure, why not on that one? Well, one of the ways that I often just operate and do this work is by thinking about who aren't we speaking to, right? Who's not here but should be? Who are we not thinking about, and why not? And what are the barriers to access, to entry, to whether it's about the employee base or recruiting, or certainly even our users or clients, etc. And so all of the language that we are using is looking to make sure that there's no one left behind. Right? I actually started my career at Children's Defense Fund, and that was Mary White Edelman's, that was her thing, leave no child behind, but make sure no one is left behind. And that, and what that means is that we are required, because of that commitment, to look at everything. It is amazing how much language how gendered language is in every term, and it is of course, depending on where you sit, it doesn't feel exclusive unless you're not there. Right? And so we have to close our eyes, we have to look at books, we have to look at our policies. That is actually how we're doing our work, because we need to understand who are we missing, right? And how are we creating an othered experience, and what do we need to do to dismantle that? So there's a lot of work that's very much focused on just that early point of entry. It's frankly, low-hanging fruit. It's this is the basis. Hearts and minds, that's a whole nother issue. right? Like we need to keep on doing that. We can easily change a word. We can easily change a phrase. And that's where we start.
Can I push you a little bit on that and say, when you're in a position where you're starting this work, how do you do that, right? What do you look for when you said you turn to your policy first, right? How do we actually put that into practice?
Well, first, there are lots of organizations and people who've been doing this work for a long time, who've been in it. And so bringing those folks who know and can help guide, absolutely, especially when you're starting. You have to have, and I don't know where this work is, it depends where you sit, sorry, there's a little bit of feedback. But when you're sitting and trying to, first of all, I don't do this work alone. I'm very good at my job. I don't do it, I would never want to do it alone. I couldn't do it alone. And so whatever I'm looking to change or have impact on, it's really providing that guidance, and I get informed, I learn every day by people who are in this work. And so starting with educating ourselves, that's key. No matter where you are, no matter how much you think you know, we all have something to learn. So there's that. And then it is really looking at, primarily understanding, again, where there's easy course correction. It doesn't have to be that complicated. It really doesn't. And people, and in this climate, as Subha was talking about and referring, anything it can be seen as, we're getting radical, right? People don't know what radical is, right? Changing, changing something from he to she to they, which, by the way, is, first of all, cuts down on letters, right? And words can be people will raise eyebrows now. And so part of it is, again, that's the heart to minds, but the doing of it is actually, it's easier than most people would have you believe.
Can I just add a couple of things to that? Using they is not as simple and easy for someone whose brain has been programmed to think in a binary way. So I always say to people, learn to give grace and ask for grace, both ways. You will make mistakes. You won't get it right every time. But as you're going through it, figure out a way in which you can very gently, nicely nudge that other person to use the right pronoun, versus getting aggravated about it or making a big deal about it. There are ways in which you bring people along in that journey. And there were two early experiences at Merrill that I still carry with me. One of them was we did not have a domestic partner coverage at Merrill at that time. And one of our gay employees who was traveling abroad with his partner, the partner had a heart attack, and there was not, I don't know which part of the world it was, there wasn't great care there. And Merrill's CEO at that time, Bill Schreier, a devout Catholic, sent the company jet there to fly this person back in, and decided and determined that day to cover all domestic partners for Merrill employees. So you would say to yourself, my God, this is a person who probably does not agree or believe in somebody being gay, and yet when it came to being a human being, I think people are capable of remarkable things. And I use that as an example because I think you're going to need people in positions of power and authority to step up and be courageous and be bold and to be able to make some of the changes. Because if not them, then who?
I agree with you, and I also want to bring in the role of artists, because I really, it's in people with power, absolutely, and artists really are big culture shifters. Artists have this ability to move like water and to shift hearts and minds and understanding like no one else. And I also, it feels important for me to speak to this specifically because it actually has really, our larger conversation as a culture around gender has deeply affected the work that I do. A few weeks ago, I had two guys come in and kind of look around at the exhibition, which was, gorgeous photographs by an artist named Coyote Park, actually riffing on art historical works. But, with queer folks and queer and trans folks, and they went and they spit all over the work and filmed themselves, and they were like, hell no, we don't want this. And it was, it's the first time something like that has actually happened in the museum. I did a little bit of self-soothing that day and went to the visitor experience book where folks can write about their time in the museum, and there was a written note from someone who said, I've been walking around the city all day feeling weird in my body. I came here, and for the first time I felt at peace. I'm going to think about what I've seen here for the rest of my life. And so again, the impact of artists in combination with power, but also just the real stakes of the conversations that we're in. We just are recently doing a renovation, and I've made my visitor experience front entrance desk bulletproof. I'm now hiring security for our programming. I'm in Soho, like literally, we're in Soho, Manhattan, and these were not considerations in my wildest dreams a year ago, but there's a level of kind of uncertainty and ominousness that has real consequences, even in New York City.
I'm thinking about the intersection that you just identified of artists and change and power and leadership, and I'm thinking about what you said in your comment to kind of open us up around adding non-binary to the mission. And so I'm really interested in how you're thinking about ArtTable's work in this moment.
Yeah, well, that's all I'm thinking at the time. But yeah, and I was thinking about that as well, Alyssa. I'm sorry that you have to deal with that, but it sounds like you are dealing with it in a really great way in terms of reminding yourself of why your museum exists. So that's really good. That sounds really healthy. With ArtTable being, the founding mission focused on women in the visual arts, there was a lot of discussion about how to be more inclusive and how to serve a broader audience without deviating too far from our mission and our original reasons for existing. So we started that conversation probably a year ago, I want to say, and it didn't happen in isolation. We talked to a lot of consultants. We talked to people in terms of education for our board, our staff, our membership, our volunteers, around gender, around language, around how we're, organizing programs, and multiple conversations on our board. And I'm very lucky. I have a really proactive and involved and amazing board of directors who took this and ran with it, and we changed our mission statement, within a year, which doesn't always happen. Really hard to make change sometimes if you don't have all of those elements in your organization, and especially with a membership organization, because you are serving everyone, but you can't make everyone happy in terms of when you're trying to make change. And certainly at a nonprofit, you can't make change without the support of your board, the enthusiasm and the skill set of your staff, and the support of your volunteers. So if you have 2 out of 3, you're not quite there. So change like that happens very slowly, I feel like, at nonprofits, but when it does, it's really impactful. And then you bring people along with those changes and do the best you can to educate and inform and talk about it. I think that you can't just say, we're changing this and that's the end of it. But bringing people along is really the big key, I think.
Okay, so I've heard a lot of things, but one of the threads that I heard through these 4 comments was this focus on change and change being difficult. I also heard kind of different consequences or different concerns that are actually linked to language, right? So every single one of you, I would argue, as someone who doesn't do your jobs, works in either an occupation or a title or in an organization that has language associated with it that might have misconceptions associated with it, and so or just conceptions that you're grappling with. And so I'm interested in what are some of those misconceptions that you're grappling with and how are you navigating them, right? One is quite immediate and obvious to me, right? There's a violent attack on your organization and you self-soothe, and then you think about kind of structural impediments to that kind of violence, right? But there are other ways in which we might think about even more abstractly or specifically around those misconceptions. And so and no pressure to go first, but I'm interested in what are the misconceptions of your work and thinking about gender-based organizations or gender-based work, and how do you navigate that?
I'm going to start. Just, there are a lot of misconceptions about an organization like ArtTable. And we've had, many issues where it's just ladies who lunch. We just sit around, we don't really work or do anything, and we just hug it out. But these are professional people working in the art world doing amazing things. And sometimes that's not recognized, or it can be seen as a very elitist or rich or white, or all of these things have followed the organization over time, even though it may not have been what our membership looks like or what we're doing in terms of programming or anything like that. And it's really interesting. The other thing that came to mind was when I first took this job, which was about 5 years ago. I had already had a career in the arts and different roles and, 15 or so years. Never in my life had I gotten so many questions when I took a job where people would say, "Oh, is that full time?" Or, "So what do you do exactly?" But running a nonprofit. And this was, the whole first year I felt like I was explaining my job to people. And that was really disappointing because I had been a member of ArtTable in my life, working in the arts and knew the support that it gives to people in the arts, and was so surprised to get that feedback. And just, it's never left me, those questions that I got.
Sure.
One of the misconceptions they have around organizations like mine that are focused on diversity, equity, and inclusion is that it's narrowly focused just around gender and race. And when you think about creating inclusion for all, you can open that umbrella as wide as you want or shrink it back to being really narrow. One of the big ahas for me was around this concept of neurodiversity, which was fairly new to me, having grown up in a world where, believe it or not, I met the first gay person that I knew and who talked to me about being gay only after I came to this country. And I was 19 years old, so I had never been exposed to that in India. So there was a lot of ignorance about a lot of things that were different. If someone was probably autistic, they would say, "Oh, that person's just a little strange." And there was no language around understanding who these people were and how they were different, but also how they were so similar to so many things that you felt and experienced. And in this DEI journey, the big aha for me came from really getting to know this young man who was autistic, who lived near my home. And his favorite thing to do was, you could tell him what time you needed to get to work in Manhattan, and he would tell you what time you had to leave home, how long it would take you to get to the train station, which train you needed to take, what time you would get into Penn Station, and how long it would take you to walk to your office, and so you'd get there in time. So it almost became a game. And then I realized that he knew more about airports and airplanes, more about train schedules and bus schedules, and you think to yourself, how can one brain hold this much information? And yet he was socially awkward. He had all of the other issues and challenges that somebody that was autistic may face. And I realized that as a world, we discard people for what they are not, instead of trying to find a way to include them for what they are. And so that became a mission. And when I was at Freddie Mac, we built an autism internship program that then turned out to be, that's just one element of difference, neurodiversity. It could be so many others. And if you find a way to look for what this person brings that is remarkable and unique and special, all of a sudden all the things that kind of make them different sort of fades away. And then you realize that that's in your brain, that's between your ears, and we have the ability to do that. And just like Brian McNaught said to me, you live in a heterosexual world and you don't know, you take so many things for granted, and we do. So what I have really learned, that as an organization, yes, to be focused on gender, we started out as an organization focusing on working mothers, creating programs, policies, and support for women in the workforce, during and through their childbearing, child-rearing years. But then it evolved into, what are the lessons learned from that we could apply to, racial diversity and the exclusion that happens there, or the lack of opportunity there. You then go to abilities and disabilities, you go to generational differences, religious differences. There are so many nuances to how each of us can be different, and all of a sudden you begin to realize, like, I'm not that similar to everyone else myself. I'm pretty different myself. I've done a good job of hiding all those quirks so you don't get to see them, but they're there. And if you realize that, then you have a little humor. You can laugh at yourself a little bit, and you can find a way to be gracious and generous to somebody else.
So, I'm Chief Diversity and Culture Officer at Yahoo. I'm also the president of a gender equity brand, Culture Makers. I never wanted the title of Chief Diversity Officer because I felt like how it was understood was extremely myopic.
Yeah.
What was possible in that title was extremely limited. And I often talk about the fact that I would talk to some of the most innovative brains. I talked to the founder of Airbnb. I talked to all these different people who were inventing incredible things, disrupting. And then when you started to talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, they'd go to 1973 playbook. All of a sudden we're talking about Kodak, Instamat. It's what happened, right? And it is, so that was sort of the challenge that I had with this, this understanding of this title. And so when coming to Yahoo, I actually decided that we, Gillian Gualtieri, who's the CEO, and I, we're going to reinvent what people understand this to be. Because what it should be is transformation, right? It's growth, it's a growth strategy, it's understanding that you're actually able to accomplish quite a bit and do a lot for so many when you dive into and you're addressing a specific, you're trying to solve for something very specific. An example that's used often, and I use it as well, is the idea of the sidewalk ramps, right? That were created for wheelchair accessibility. Think about all the people who use that ramp, right? Delivery people in strollers, kids on scooters. They're it goes on and on. And the idea is that if we're able to actually think about those who are most aggrieved, right, and those who need it the most from all of us, it actually lifts all of our boats, right? And so that was, again, I don't know why Marion is on my mind today. There's got to be something, we'll look it up. But one of the things I remember when I was right out of college, I was working at Children's Defense Fund. I was helping edit. I was the secretary for the general counsel there. And I was helping edit their report on child poverty in America, which also changed the course of my life because I wanted to be a diplomat overseas and decided to focus on domestic policy. And I kept on thinking, okay, so we're reading it because I was thinking, we're focusing on children. It's Children's Defense Fund. When you read it, you really saw she was lifting up mothers. She was lifting up people who were socioeconomically challenged, because in order to take care of children, there had to be all of these other things in place. And so that's one of the things that I get very excited about in this work, but is not understood. That it's, there's sort of a textbook, here are the 4 things that you do if you're a chief diversity officer. as opposed to we actually have the ability to transform how people understand each other, what we're able to do and create to make sure that the least of us thrives, and then what happens to the rest of us? Bountiful. So that is, I mean, I love this work, I love this job, it's constantly evolving if we're staying alert and on it. But the challenge was that, for me, was that the idea of it is often I have to sort of dismantle and disrupt what people think is gonna happen when they see me.
I so appreciate what all of you said and just this reiterating of actually biodiversity. Diversity is good for all of us. And on a slight tangent, I've become obsessed with biomimicry in science, and how really our top innovators and scientists in the world are learning from biology and the natural world all around us, and it's true diversity. You know, in terms of misperceptions, misconceptions, I spoke a little bit about this idea that an LGBTQIA+ art museum is only for folks who identify that way, which is actually quite a broad umbrella. But, you know, and again, sort of thinking through human desire, human self-performativity, how we are in the world is something that each of us can access. I also, you know, have a little, as someone who comes from the art world, have a little bit of a chip on my shoulder about this museum being taken seriously in the art world. We can, you know, talk shit about the art world, but I also have a lot of fondness for it, and I think, you know, there's a lot of value in it. And so really part of my work has been raising visibility and respect for the exhibitions we're mounting, the artists that we're working, our artist fellowships that we're bringing on, regardless of their identities, you know, to be taken seriously and legitimately in the art world at large.
Okay, so I think time-wise, I have time for one more question.
We do.
One more. Okay, fabulous. Okay. Well, then I'm going to ask a big one that comes, I'm going to take inspiration from the title of our panel today. And I'm going to, because I have the microphone, I get to do what I want. So I'm going to combine two questions that I wanted to ask, which is, I'm interested in what is the future of gender-based organizations on an abstract level, but also I'm really interested in pushing all of you to ground it in what is one next step that would help you see the future of gender-based organizations that you'd like to see, right? I'd really like to end, hopefully, which is strange for sociologists, we're usually doomsday predictors, but what is the future of gender-based organizations, and what is one step, either in your organization, your own work, or that you would like to task us with to start seeing the next step?
Start.
No, but you can just hold the microphone.
All right, I'll start because I don't want to go after you. Well, you know, I actually am very hopeful. I mean, I think part of what, the reason I love this work is because I truly believe in humanity. I think that there's so much possibility, and I always, you know, there's sometimes when people are talking about diversity and okay, there's that problem or that challenge. Like, there's actually, it's all opportunity. It's all opportunity for us to be better, to know each other better, to understand each other more, to be able to do more things. And I think, so that's just, again, like I'm very optimistic in that realm of, I do believe in humanity. I think for the future of gender-based organizations, I think that what it means, frankly, is that we actually all have to take that leap of faith and understand that what we are living in, we actually have to start disrupting. Right? Like we're so confined by what we think is supposed to be. And that, I mean, it's true. Like, I mean, I live it all the time. I catch myself. I do this work and I catch myself constantly of like what the limitations are that actually aren't real, but are just so rote that I absorb them and perpetuate them. And so what I'm hoping is that we're all in this conversation, and I think, going back to Barbie, because it all goes back to Barbie now, is that we actually can help deprogram each other and help or reprogram each other to know and see like just everything that who we are, what we're capable of, what we don't have to hide behind if we're doing the finances for the household and pretend that we're not running things. There's so much opportunity there that's where I think why the future is bright, because if we're actually able to do this together, the notion of what is required for a gender-based organization, it gets completely reimagined.
I want to piggyback on that because I totally agree and add, I feel like honestly, graciousness and grace. Just hearing you speak about the evolution of ArtTable and no, non-binary was not a broad concept or, when the organization was founded. And to your point, Subha, about sort of like, oh, well, I might get they, them wrong. An ability to kind of be gracious for each other and to know that language evolves, but that human care and compassion and possibility is always the bedrock of that, and to kind of, be excited about that.
I would say to you that our next generation, the Gen Zers, give me so much hope. If you think about what happened, it used to be that working moms needed maternity leave. What do you have now? You have gender neutral leave. Everybody wants to get time off. If you have a child, male, female, it didn't matter. You want, and organizations are transforming to make that possible. I wish I could say it's organizations like mine that absolutely made that happen. No, it was the generational shift that accelerated it. Similarly, you talk about flexibility, something that post-pandemic, most women who are taking care of their children at home have had a harder time getting back to quote unquote, back to the office. And the reality is it's this next generation that says flexibility isn't just for parenting and caregiving. Flexibility is for I have a passion for, and I need time for that. I want flexibility for that. So they are actually forcing organizations, and I talk about the corporate world because that's the world I live in. And to me, I call out, I hope nobody hears from Goldman Sachs, but I use them as an example all the time. The analysts and associates there used to come in at 8 o'clock in the morning, and then they had to work till 3 in the morning. They'd go home, shower, change, get an hour's sleep, and come back again. Till one of them stood up and said, "You don't assign me work till noon. Why do you need me to come in at 8? And when one said it, enough of them said it, they changed the policy. They could come in at noon. They still had to work till 3 in the morning, but they could come in at noon. So you tell me that those voices cannot change the status quo, and they are doing it. They're doing it every day in so many different ways. And when you find, I had an interesting conversation with a very conservative friend who said to me, I just can't understand it. Like, what is the issue? It's just a mixed up feeling that they're going through when they are, going through adolescence. And I said, she's talking about non-binary folk. And I thought to myself, do I really need to get into this with her? And then I thought, why not? And I did, and I said to her, do you know how difficult you make lives for somebody like that? So do you think it's something they are eagerly racing towards? You know how hard it is? You know how difficult it is to live in a body that you just feel like you're not in the right gender? And I said, maybe you should meet one of them and get to know them and talk about what their lives are like. Because once you do, you'll realize it isn't a choice. It's the same way when, I think it was in 2004, we had one person in our Japan office wanting to go through a gender transition. A hue and cry about, that's not covered, we don't do that. And I said, let's look at the data. How many people have we had ask for it in the last 15 years? 2. they're not exactly, just because you offer it doesn't mean the whole world is going to race towards gender transition. It was ridiculous in terms of how they immediately turned it into an economic thing. Oh, it's going to cost so much for our healthcare benefits, etc. Not thinking about all those people who smoked their ways through and ended up with all kinds of diseases. Anyway, I digress. You can see I was very upset about that. But the reality is, if we each, and I think that this is not the people in this room, it's the people who are not in this room, who really don't understand it, that actually need to have conversations where they can think calmly about, what does this really mean? Help them understand, help them meet somebody who is trans to understand what their life journey and experience has been. And I think you change them. Now, you're not going to change all of them, but you will change enough of them. Because in this country, we have, about 15-20% that'll never get it. You'll have another 15-20% that get it readily. And then you have the whole chunk in the middle. That's who we need to really talk to and work with. And if we can't have conversations, what people call across the aisle, then we're always going to be isolated. So my hope is that this next generation teaches us how to have those conversations in an impactful, meaningful way, and that's how you're going to change the world.
I was thinking back again to when I first took this job, and not just the naysayers that were like, is this full time, but the people who asked me if this was a long-term role. And thinking about, well, I don't think there's going to be equality in the art world in a year. So I'm probably in a job for a little bit, and I don't want to jinx myself out of a job. So hopefully there's a future, there's a place that people want to carve out space with similar interests and similar roles. The one thing that I would like to see is allyship. Everyone in this room, I don't see any men. It's common at ArtTable programs to not, a public program that's not just focused on our membership. We don't see a lot of allyship, and I would like to see more of that, because that's going to help to make change for all of us. So tell all your friends.
And now we get to hear from all of you. So I'm gonna hand this mic off, and if you just raise your hand, we will
Come to you. Sorry, I left that dangling.
So I have a question. I'm Lorraine Harrington, CEO of Catalyst, and I'd like to get your perspective on the current backlash occurring in the DEI world and the politicizing of all these issues, and how we should be how you're dealing with it, and how you talk about it publicly.
I'll just jump in because I'm about to go to my board to talk about how we're dealing with all of the backlash. Exactly. I will say that I have really focused on language. I think the work, so the meta is, what is this about? This is about, I'm hoping, last gasp, right? This is like, seeing writing on the wall. Like, look at this room. Yes, we're missing allies, agree. Look at this room. Like, incredible, powerful women in this room, right? This is, there's absolutely, I think, I would also say there's a significant racial element to the backlash, and a lot of caveats when pressed for anyone who's sort of carrying that banner. But having said that, one of the things that actually is really important, and this is sort of when I started to talk about sort of the systems change and policy change, I don't do diversity programs. I'm actually trying to make sure that everyone who is in our company is included, has an opportunity to thrive, has what they need to be able to do the work to the best of their ability, are treated fairly. And that's it. What does it mean then when we have to make sure that there are some people who, for whom policies weren't thought about when the policies were being crafted, right? They weren't thought about when we were making decisions about remote working. They weren't thought about, and so making sure that we are including everyone in our thinking about what is going to make a successful company. And that's how I focus on the work. And there are areas where we need to do better. I'm in tech. Women were in tech and left. right? So my job is even harder to try to create any kind of equity and bring women back in. There are virtually the number of Latinos and Black people in tech, abysmal. There is and Yahoo's really bad. I mean, we have our public numbers, so everyone could see them if they want. But it is, and there was always a interest. But the true notion of this is that there is a lot of work to make sure that everyone in that building has a sense of belonging. And there's nothing inequitable about that. And that is how I approach the work. That's how we engage. That's how we look at our systems, our processes, that they actually lift, again, beneficial for all and making sure that everyone has an opportunity to thrive.
So we actually go back to the data, and whether it is who's your customer going to be, if 19% of this country is Latino Hispanic, and their average age is 28, they are your future big consumers. So if you don't find a way to include them and don't have a reflection of them in your workforce, whether it is cars that you build and sell, or technology, or financial products, you've got to think about ultimately how do you create a reflection of the communities you want to serve within your organizations. And right now, I think the important thing is to focus on actions and behaviors versus just words. I remember somebody just was very offended about there being some language around white privilege. But there's a different way to phrase that. You don't have to call it white privilege. You think about all of the notions that go with someone that has the privilege versus someone who doesn't. And I'd be hard-pressed to find one person that would stand up to say, I'd rather be unfair and unjust rather than the other. So I think that this is a time to continue to do the work, but to really mind the language you use so it isn't polarizing enough to just turn someone off. Because you can go to the most rabid Trump supporter, and I will call out that name, and you say to them, what would you have to say about unfairness and injustice and not being thoughtful enough? And I'd be hard pressed, I don't care who they are, to say, well, I will be. I am unjust, I'm unfair, I'm thoughtless. The reality is people think of themselves in the best versions of who they are. And, inspire them to want to be that as opposed to be the other. There is a herd mentality, and it's pretty sad that there are so many followers for that, but I think you have to continue to do the work, and you have to be unafraid to talk to those that you think are the other, because that is what creates a bigger chasm. And so that's one of the things we're focused on, is how do you not let words get in the way of ultimately doing the right things, the right actions, the right behaviors.
I think we have a question in the back. Yeah.
So I was in college in the 1980s, and I was in an all-female, all-original musical comedy troupe that had been largely formed in response to the all-male comedy troupe, which had been founded in the 1880s. So 2 years ago, the male troupe, in response to backlash, became co-ed. And then the women in our group were faced with a decision about what to do. And we had lengthy discussions and decided that we would be a group for underrepresented genders. So instead of being all female, it would be underrepresented genders. And I'm really curious what those of you who are in it, what do you think of that solution? We had so many interesting discussions about the pros and cons of that. I'd love to hear what you think.
Well, I use the phrase underrepresented all the time, because it also, to your point too about language, we often use, particularly when we're talking about people of color, a diverse person or diverse candidate, which it's, first of all, it is othering. Right? It is absolutely othering, and it also it's exclusive. And so having, like, understanding what we're all trying to do is increase representation. So the use of underrepresentation actually is something that I use quite frequently, because it can, depending on where you're sitting, you're talking about different people. The, I don't know where there's, when we, started the conversation about, like, what a gendered organization is, and, and I was thinking about, like, well, who plays in the World Cup, right? Like, is that gendered? Like, did we name it? And so there's so many things that aren't named that are clearly not about gender equity, right? And so I think the path of least resistance sometimes still allows you to do what you want to do. And so when you're, I do focus on changing behaviors and then motivation. We'll get there. So it's not a cop. I mean, I don't know if you were asking if that was a cop-out. I don't think so. I think you were still able to do your thing and then be able to be inclusive. But I do know that there is an argument to be made about why it is so important for people who have aligned interests, particularly when they're feeling like they have no other place to be able to come together in a safe way, right, and in a community. It's extremely important. We know this. It happens organically, and then it's formalized, and then we're sometimes vilified for it.
Yeah, I just want to echo that. As someone who went through a women's college situation, the empowerment as a young woman walking into that environment blew my mind, and is a big part of who I am today. And that college no longer exists. It was subsumed. It went out of business during COVID. Mills. And it just breaks my heart. And the fact that these young women and women identified folk aren't going to have that opportunity on the West Coast is just, and so the whole idea of a gender-based organization and what you just said really hit home. But how can we pull the folks behind us into this conversation in a way that's healthy, in a way that's safe? And I think ArtTable is, plays a very important part of this, and it's how, as a woman, how as a lesbian, how as an artist, as an arts administrator, that I operate in the city in a very empowered way, with a very powerful group of women, and however that is identified. But I just really want to make sure that we make this space for the folks coming up. And I want to be proactive in that in some way.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Also, your question made me think a little bit about the Boy Scouts and the Girl Scouts.
Yeah.
Right. And I was on the board of the Girl Scouts when the Boy Scouts made the change to just be the Scouts. And I can't speak for the Girl Scouts right now because I'm not on their board and I don't want to be out of turn, but there was a lot of discussion and a lot of data of why it should remain focused on girls. And it's kind of what you were talking about having that space, with other women in a certain environment. I found that space for myself growing up in sports, right? So that was an amazing thing for me and why I coach girls sports now, right? Like, cause you're giving back to the next one and the things that affect your own life in terms of your support throughout your career or your personal life, you gotta keep them around in a way. So I like that, bringing everyone along. We're getting close sometimes.
Yeah, I think we are at time, but I want to just echo what was said. I think it's interesting, right? I do work at a women's institution, historically women's institution, and many of us have these. We spent a lot of time tonight talking about language, right, and like gender-based organizations, and maybe that's my fault because I started with what does this even mean, but I want. Oh, thank you. It's very thank you. I'm just a mess. I'm a butterfingers. But I really hope that all of us can came away with questions, some answers, a further drive for conversation. There certainly are snacks to keep us from keep the conversation going. And I just want to express extreme gratitude to our panelists, to all of you who are here, to ArtTable, and to the Women's Forum for making this evening possible. Thank you, everyone.